Hey guys, what is up? In my last video, I made sort of an offhand reference to Frostbite, and I had wondered in one of the subtitles whether it would be best to reset Frostbite damage with some sort of fire weapon or a throwing bomb, or if instead it would be better to keep the Frostbite and let the debuffs stay, and we'll talk more about those in a moment. But I didn't really give it much more thought than that. In the comments on the video, I got quite a few comments actually about it, and some were certain that I would be best off resetting Frostbite after proccing it, while others thought it would be silly to reset Frostbite. And I thought that's sort of interesting, and the more I looked into it and the more I thought about it, the less certain I was which the better course of action would be. So I went looking to see, because I assumed somewhere somebody has done the analysis and figured out the best approach. I was actually pretty surprised to see I couldn't find any videos. I thought Limit Breakers may have addressed it. And I did find plenty of videos from people like Chase the Bro and PvP Skills on Frostbite builds, but nobody talking about the trade-offs of resetting Frostbite versus leaving it in place. Even Reddit, I wasn't able to find anything that was directly on point. I thought that was a little bit surprising, so I went and I had some discussions with some of my friends, and we had kind of come up with a framework for thinking about it, and thanks to Mook and Silly Dog and others for helping me think about it. But eventually I realized the only way to be sure how to approach this would be to test it. So before we can get into discussing the trade-offs, we need to make sure we're all aligned on what are the actual effects of Frostbite, and there are three of them. The first and most obvious is you take some extra damage. So you take the damage associated with the attack as you normally would, plus when Frostbite procs, you take additional damage, and that additional damage is actually 11% of your total potential HP, so not 11% of what your health is at that moment, but your total overall HP, plus a flat amount of 85. Now in practice, what does that mean? That means somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 to 300 HP of damage, plus the damage of the attack itself. Then you also face two debuffs. One is a 15% stamina regen debuff. The second is a 7% absorption debuff, and both the stamina and absorption debuffs are active throughout the duration of Frostbite, which I think is around 30 seconds. So there's a trade-off here. You can reset the status effects, the debuff effects of Frostbite with any kind of fire-based attack, and that could be a fire-based weapon, it could be a throwing bomb, it could be an exploding bolt. Any of those things will reset Frostbite. The trade-off is you lose the 15% stamina debuff, you lose the 7% absorption debuff, but what you gain in return is the ability to proc Frostbite again. So in essence, you're giving up a guaranteed set of debuffs, the stamina and the absorption debuff, in exchange for a chance at proccing Frostbite again. So this is kind of an interesting question. What's the best way to go about this? Well, I think the circumstances sort of dictate, but let's look at some of the testing that we did. So for testing, I did a few things. The first thing I did was I went and I looked at my recent video, and I started looking at the amount of damage that I was doing, both before I proc Frostbite and then after I proc Frostbite. And what I found is that the differences were really pretty underwhelming. The differences, and this was around soul level 40, and for me, actually, I was soul level 46. Based on some comments that I saw in my video, I believe the host was soul level 40, though I can't be sure of that. In general, the damage numbers I saw were really underwhelming, and we're talking about roughly an extra 7% in damage, so somewhere between 6 and 10 points per attack. It was at this point that I realized that I needed to do some more extensive testing, so I enlisted the help of my friend Spectre, and we did a number of tests. And what we did was we tested out damage before and after Frostbite. We tested it on two different builds, soul level 40 and soul level 125. In addition, on each build, we focused on three different armor sets. We focused on a very low defense armor set, a more typical armor defense set, and then the highest Frostbite defense set that we could find. What I expected to find was that at lower soul levels, the amount of extra damage due to the absorption debuff would be pretty low, but then at higher levels, I imagine the amount of extra damage due to the debuff would be quite a bit higher. In actual fact, the amount of additional damage due to the 7% debuff was pretty consistent, and it was pretty consistently low. I mean, it was almost laughable. It was very negligible. We're talking, again, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 10 points per additional attack. So when you start comparing the numbers and you realize that your opponent's only taking 5 to 10 extra points of damage due to the debuff per attack, and yet you have the potential of doing an extra 250 to 300 for proccing Frostbite again, suddenly resetting Frostbite looks like the best option. But it's not quite so clear, and there's a couple reasons why. First of all, it ignores the stamina debuff, and the stamina debuff is very hard to quantify its value, and I think it really depends on the situation that you're in. So in the analysis I did, what I concluded is that there's really a few things you have to think about. So the longer a fight wears on, all else held equally, the more you're going to want to reset Frostbite, because a longer fight means more opportunities to reset Frostbite. The other thing to think about is how many attacks it takes to actually proc Frostbite. And again, it's difficult to quantify because it's not really a number of attacks, it's a number of attacks of a particular type over a particular duration, but you can kind of get a general sense for this. At lower levels, I found that generally it was somewhere around 4 to 6 attacks, again, depending on how well they're spaced or the timing between them. Whereas at soul level 125, it was often the case that it took upwards of 10 or more attacks to proc Frostbite. So if it takes few hits to proc Frostbite, then the probability of proccing Frostbite again is pretty high, and so again, it makes sense to reset Frostbite. Or if your opponent's resistances happen to be especially low, it makes more sense to reset it. So in an invasion context, where you know your opponents are going to go through a lot of Estus, the fight's going to be very prolonged, I think resetting Frostbite is 100% the clear thing to do. And I can't really imagine any scenario under which you would not want to reset Frostbite. On the other hand, in a dueling situation, it's going to be very challenging to even proc Frostbite to begin with, especially if you're dueling at 125. So you're not likely to proc it a second time, meaning it would be pretty silly to reset because you're going to give up on the debuffs, but you're unlikely to get anything in return in the form of increased damage. So bringing this all home, what I really expected to find was that at low levels, resetting Frostbite would make sense. At higher levels, it would be less clear, but that's not at all what I found. Across the board, in an invasion context, you almost always want to reset Frostbite, especially if you're focused on one opponent. If you have multiple opponents and you're switching between them, maybe it makes less sense to try to reset it. But again, the increase in damage from the 7% debuff, it's so small, it's so negligible. Even if there's a small chance of resetting Frostbite or proccing Frostbite again, you almost always want to reset it. It's really only in duels where I think it makes sense not to reset Frostbite, where instead the debuffs to stamina help enough, the additional damage from the absorption debuff is enough, and most importantly, the low probability of being able to proc Frostbite multiple times. I think those all argue for leaving the stamina effects in place and not resetting Frostbite in duels. I want to give a special thanks to Mr. Silly Dog, Mook, and others for helping me talk this through. And then I also want to thank Spectre for helping me test this out and taking the time to assist me. Thanks, guys, and thanks everyone for stopping by, and take care, everyone.